Yeah. You ready? What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, bringing you my favorite video series of all time, the top Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. I look forward to each and every time I get to do these recaps. I get to see the splendid amount of auctions that come by. Thank you so much for tuning in, folks. If you are a fan of PSA, BGS, CGC graded cards, I got a lot for you in this video. We're going to cover so much vintage and modern. Before we get started, a quick shout out to today's auction recap sponsor, the one and only lowpopping.com. After the recap, folks, head over to lowpopping.com, where they have a multitude of Pokemon card grails available for sale. Beside me here is a huge variety of cards available graded by PSA, BGS, and CGC. Featuring cards from pretty much every generation of the Pokemon TCG, there really is something here for everyone. As I always say, one of the unique things about lowpopping.com is your ability to trade or make offers on pretty much anything you see listed. Their buy now, pay later options on cards above $1,000 is another benefit to take advantage of when buying directly from the website. And it's also worth noting they are very flexible on payment preferences as well. Support this channel and support a reputable seller in this community by going to lowpopping.com. A link to their website will be in the description of this video. Trust me, folks, you won't be disappointed with the selection they have. All right, folks, I think that 98% of the auctions we're going to cover were on eBay this week. Let's get started off with Surging Sparks with this PSA 10 Magneton from the Surging Sparks Pokemon Center Elite Trainer box. Sold for some big numbers this week. Here we saw one sell for $660. And let me just say, we have an absolute plethora of PSA 10s coming by in auction. We'll cover a few of those in next week's recap. Here also from Surging Sparks is a PSA 10 Skyridge that sold for $380. Here we have a hyper rare Gold Pikachu EX in PSA 10 that sold for $848. And then on to the special illustration rare Pikachu EX. I think it's cooled off a little bit this week in terms of PSA 10s. It was selling for about $2,750. Another one sold for $2,275, but the most recent PSA 10 sold for about $2,000. So I think we're calming down just a little bit as more and more of these PSA 10 copies hit the market. Up next, we have the Magikarp illustration rare from Paldea Evolved, hitting some pretty phenomenal numbers. Here's one that sold for $850, another one that sold for $840. Not too bad for a Magikarp, if you ask me. Here we have the Charmander promo from the Pokemon Center Elite Trainer box. Hit, I think, a new record price this week as a PSA 10, selling for $821 big ones. A couple of Black Label cards came by. Here is a Blaziken VMAX alt art from Chilling Reign, sold this week for $3,050. And then we saw a Black Label Japanese Sylveon VMAX that sold for $2,800. Here we have a Latios GX alt art from Team Up in PSA 10 that sold for $2,850. And then we saw this one here sell for $2,700. But what I'm wondering is, does the buyer of this card realize that this is a Portuguese copy? I don't know. When you look at it from a glance, it looks like an English copy, but it is in fact Portuguese, and it fails to say that in the title, so I hope the buyer of this card realized it's a Portuguese copy. I don't know. Up next, the Umbreon VMAX continues to be very healthy. Here's a PSA 10 that sold for $1,820, while the CGC 10 Pristine copy sold for $2,130. And folks, check out this copy that has a nice little cover over the slab that kind of expands the art. Very cool looking. This one sold for $1,795, so the additional art there didn't quite add to the value, but I think that's a phenomenal concept to put on your graded cards. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Rayquaza VMAX from Evolving Skies that sold for $1,009. And then here we have those legendary birds again, the Stained Glass, Moltres, Articuno, and Zapdos from the Hidden Face Elite Trainer box. Last week sold for $100. This week sold for $137. So the value of this card is also rising very quickly. Here we have another Alola Friends Japanese Full Art Trainer in PSA 10. Continues to decline quite drastically. This week, a copy sold for $1,775. And I think it was just last week this card was selling for $2,225. So, man, almost a $500 decrease in just a week. This card has really plummeted in value compared to what it was a year and a half ago. Speaking of plummeting in value, here is the Rayquaza Amazing Rare from Vivid Voltage. I like to bring this card up every once in a while because this week it sold for $28 as a PSA 10. And if you're not familiar with the mayhem that occurred 4 years ago, this card used to sell for over $400, folks. If my memory serves me right, this was a $400+ card. Now down to 28, so I like to just remind you of that every once in a while. Here from Evolutions, we saw the holographic Chansey as a PSA 10 sell for $1,026. And this card has had a wild journey as well. When it was first released on the market, it had like 4 PSA 10 copies and was selling for like $1,233. And then about a year or two later, this card decreased in value to about $600. But since then has came back up to a little over $1,000. And this card currently has 22 PSA 10 examples. Up next, we have the Charizard Holo from Evolutions in PSA 10, sold for $1,185. Up next, a couple of interesting Rainbow Rare Charizard VMAXs. Here is the Charizard VMAX from Champion's Path. Just one of those cards that was so hyped up during the time, has a million copies, and sold this week for $265, while the Rainbow Rare Charizard GX from Burning Shadows had 2 sales this week, one for $2,751, another for $2,802. And then here we have an error card. This is a fold-over error. The Team Magma's Groudon from the Celebration set sold for $838 as a CGC 7.5. So, pretty interesting. Here we have a no damage Ninetales. This is a shadowless base set card graded a PSA 8. As you can see, it's missing the attack number there, which makes it quite rare. Sold for $1,950 this week. Here is a CGC 10 Pristine First Edition Blaine's Charizard that sold for $4,056. A CGC 10 Gem Mint Reverse Holo Charizard from Legendary Collection that sold for $4,827. And then here is a PSA 8 Unlimited Lugia Holo from Neo Genesis that sold for twice as much as the Buy It Now, or just about twice as much, at $787. Some auctions, folks, are absolutely wild. To this card's defense, the centering on it looks really good. The back looks really clean, so I'm assuming whatever's wrong with it must be in the holo. Here we have a first edition Espeon holo from Neo Discovery, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,170. A CGC 10 first edition Shining Steelix sold for $1,527. Here is a holo Gengar from Skyridge. Hit some big numbers this week, selling for $8,099 as a PSA 10. Here's a holographic Houndoom from Aquapolis as a PSA 10, sold for $2,335. And then a CGC 10 Pristine Holo Houndoom from Skyridge that sold for $1,826. Here we have a couple more Crystal Charizard. This is a card that has skyrocketed this past year. Here is a PSA 9 example that sold for $8,162, which was almost the cost of a PSA 10 last year. Almost. This is like a $10,000 card as a PSA 10, so the PSA 9's getting there. But we did see a PSA 10 come through, and it sold for $15,239 US. Here we have a Gold Star Gyarados from EX Holon Phantoms. This is a newer cert PSA 10 Gold Star Gary that sold for an even $18,000. Woo mama. Here we have a Rayquaza C Lv.X in PSA 10 that sold for $1,287 US. And then here, folks, is quite the disparity between a PSA 9 and PSA 10. We saw this PSA 9 Glaceon Lv.X from Majestic Dawn sold this week for $425, which is a far cry from the cost of a PSA 10. I think the last PSA 10 example sold for about $8,400. $425 for a 9, $8,400 for a 10. We saw a couple of fan club promos come by. Here's a PSA 10 500 point EV fan club promo card that sold for $5,400. The PSA 10 Porygon here sold for $3,431. And then we saw this PSA 9 Magikarp that sold for $6,325. And then here, folks, we have a lot of 9 empty booster boxes from the E series and then the early EX era boxes. 9 total empty boxes sold for $686. And then here we have an XY Furious Fist Elite Trainer box that sold for $1,525. And these early XY Elite Trainer boxes, and especially the black and white Elite Trainer boxes, can go for some pretty large sums of cash. And then to finish off this recap, we have a couple auctions from Alt. This week we have a black label Japanese Rayquaza VMAX sold for $6,251. Here is a black label Japanese Rockets Suicune EX that sold for $7,014. And then just one of those beta playtest cards I wanted to go over. It is the CGC 9.5 Gengar that sold this week for $7,801. Up next, a couple of very high-end Japanese promos. Here is a BGS 8.5 University Magikarp that sold for $8,100 this week. Here is a BGS 9.5 Spiky-Eared Pichu that sold for $9,406. Here's a PSA 10 Misaki Gengar promo that sold for $9,900. And then here is another Spiky-Eared Pichu. This one is a PSA 8 that sold for $10,554. And then the final auction would have to be this PSA 10 Illusions Zora that sold for $10,800. This is a contest winner card that is quite expensive. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the recap. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to go check out lowpopping.com on your way out. I would really appreciate it. That's all I got today, folks. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll catch you in my next one.